Out beyond the last maintained trailhead, past the final dirt road where even the Forest Service trucks hesitate to go, there are towers, thin, skeletal structures that claw their way above the tree canopy. At first glance, they look abandoned, fragile, forgotten, but they aren't. They're occupied by individuals who've agreed to a job most people wouldn't consider for more than a few seconds. To live alone, at elevation, for long stretches of time. No neighbors, no traffic, no cell service, just radio check-ins and a vast, unpredictable wilderness stretching in every direction. The official purpose is clear: fire detection. Each lookout is responsible for scanning the forest, the ridge lines, the valleys, watching for the telltale wisp of smoke that can turn a green range into a smoldering ruin. But unofficially, something else happens up there. Something few are willing to describe in detail, and even fewer are willing to believe. What draws people to these posts isn't always a love of nature. Some are trying to disappear. Others are chasing silence, as if quiet is a kind of redemption. But no matter their reasons, they all learn the same lesson. The silence out there isn't empty. It holds things, and it listens back. In the beginning, the isolation feels manageable, maybe even beautiful. There's a rhythm to life in the tower. Sunup, coffee, a slow 360-degree scan, logging the weather, journaling, cooking simple meals, reading old books. Evenings often arrive unnoticed because the world outside becomes so still you forget the hours are passing. But then, something small changes. And that's always how it begins. Never with a scream, never with chaos. Just a slight misalignment. A wrongness too subtle to describe, but too persistent to ignore. A figure you swear was standing at the tree line. But isn't there the next time you look? A flash of movement you chalk up to wind, until you realize the trees were motionless. A voice, impossibly faint, repeating your name over the radio, though no one else is supposed to be on your channel. A tapping on the metal stairs beneath your floorboards in the middle of the night, light, deliberate, and patient. Most brush it off. A trick of altitude, a side effect of being alone too long. And maybe that's true. Maybe it's all explainable. But if you talk to enough lookouts, you start to notice patterns. You start to hear phrases like, "I never used to believe in that stuff." Or, "It waited until my second season to show up." And it's not just limited to one region. From the thick pine forests of Washington state to the bone-dry hills of Arizona, from the frozen spines of the Rockies to the swamplands along the southern edge of the Appalachians. Stories surface. Quiet ones. The kind passed along at the end of a long shift, when the fire's dying down and no one really wants to be the first to stand up and leave. The stories vary in their details, but there are consistencies. The sense of being watched, the certainty that something else is out there, something that doesn't need firelight to see. Strange noises, structures in the woods that weren't on any map, unmarked trails that appear overnight and vanish just as quickly. Locked doors found open in the morning, untouched food, footprints in snow that begin and end in impossible places. Many lookouts finish their term and leave with no intention of ever returning. Some request reassignment to lower elevations. A few, for reasons they rarely articulate, simply stop responding. These towers, these outposts perched on ridges and cliffsides, are more than fire stations. They are thresholds, points at which civilization fades into something older, something untamed. And once you cross that threshold, even if it's only for a season, something changes. It stays with you. Maybe it's the altitude. Maybe it's the solitude. Or maybe just maybe these places were never meant to be occupied in the first place. Tonight, you'll hear 8 of the most unsettling reports ever whispered down through Forest Service channels, shared in anonymous forums, or buried in forgotten logs, never meant for public eyes. stories that begin in silence and end with questions no one's been able to answer. Some of these accounts come from experienced rangers, others from first-time volunteers. A few have refused to speak about their time in the tower ever again. The names have been changed, the locations left vague for their protection. But the events, they were written down, sometimes obsessively, sometimes in shaking handwriting on the backs of old maps. 8 tales, 8 people, 8 encounters that hint at something lurking beyond the realm of wildfire and weather. And whether you believe them or not isn't the point. What matters is this: they all thought they'd be alone out there, and they were wrong. Some men are remembered for their courage, others for their contribution to science or history. Roy Cleveland Sullivan is remembered for something else entirely, something that neither logic nor chance can quite explain. Over the course of his life, Sullivan was struck by lightning not once, not twice, but 7 times. And he survived every single encounter. But to begin to understand this story, you have to go back, not to his final lightning strike, or even his second or third, but to the very first. A storm in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia in 1942, a newly built fire lookout tower, and a young man, barely 20 years old, climbing the stairs for his shift as a park ranger with the National Park Service. The tower had just been completed. It was bare. No insulation, no grounding wires, no lightning rod. An oversight, perhaps, or a rushed construction due to the demands of wartime. Either way, it left Sullivan exposed, elevated more than 30 feet above the forest canopy, with little more than corrugated metal walls and a metal roof above him. The structure became an accidental conductor for the most violent force in nature. The storm moved in fast. A towering wall of black clouds swelled over the mountains. Thunder echoed through the hollows like distant cannon fire. Sullivan recalled the hair on his arms standing straight up, a dry metallic taste rising in his mouth. And then, light. He didn't remember much after that. Not the precise moment the bolt struck, or the milliseconds of blinding white that followed. Only the aftermath, his boots blown open, eyebrows singed clean, and the unmistakable smell of ozone and scorched fabric. The bolt had split the wooden frame of the tower and left a burn mark across his body, from shoulder to foot. They called it an accident, a freak event, a statistical anomaly. But the anomaly didn't end. Over the next 35 years, Roy Sullivan would be struck 6 more times, each event carefully documented by hospital reports, Park Service records, and eventually Guinness World Records. The second time it struck him while driving his truck through the mountains. The third while he was in his front yard. The fourth inside a ranger station. The fifth while patrolling a campground. The sixth while fishing. And the seventh in 1977 as he walked along a trail near his home. He saw a cloud form above him and began to run, but he couldn't outrun it. The bolt came anyway. Each time he survived. But the damage accumulated. Burn scars covered large portions of his body. His toenails were blackened and fell off more than once. He suffered partial hearing loss. His hair, once thick and dark, turned thin and brittle. But the physical wounds were only a part of the story. Privately, Sullivan grew wary. He noticed animals and birds avoiding him, veering away when he approached, as if they sensed something unnatural. His colleagues began to joke nervously about never standing too close to him during storms. Some even refused to be near him at all once clouds began to gather. But the most unsettling part was what Roy never put on paper. In several interviews near the end of his life, he alluded to feelings that accompanied the strikes. That each time, minutes before, he would feel a shift, like the pressure in the world around him had dropped, like something unseen had entered the atmosphere. He described it as a hum in his bones, a vibration that crawled up his spine. And always, the same image before the flash, a shadow at the edge of his vision. Still, watching. Many dismissed these claims as hallucinations brought on by trauma. But there were others who believed something stranger was at work. Some speculated that Sullivan had become what folklore sometimes calls a storm mark, a person touched by forces in the natural world that do not easily let go, as if the first strike had opened something in him, made him visible to a force that does not forget. There were rumors, too, that Sullivan had begun keeping journals in the years after his fifth strike. Not just logs of dates and storms, but symbols, sketches, dreams, drawings of spiraling clouds with eyes at their center. He told a fellow ranger that during one particularly bad storm, while hiding beneath a rock overhang, he heard a voice in the thunder. It didn't say words exactly, but he understood it, and he understood that it would come again. These journals were never recovered. Friends recall that in his later years, he grew increasingly paranoid. He stopped venturing out during cloudy weather. He took to carrying a can of water in his truck at all times and avoided open fields. When asked why he didn't move away from the mountains, from Virginia, from the forests altogether, he would only respond, "It'll find me anyway. Doesn't matter where I go." He passed away in 1983 from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, reportedly over an unrequited love. But there are those who believe the story doesn't end there. Some say he had grown tired of waiting for the next strike, that the fear of what lingered in the clouds had become too great. Others whisper that he wasn't afraid of dying, only of how it would happen. And then there are the oddities. Reports, unverified of course, of a ranger in Shenandoah who, decades later, claims to have found a burned patch of grass in the exact spot Sullivan had once been struck. A scorched ring in the middle of nowhere, perfectly round, with no known cause. Lightning, we are told, is random, that it doesn't remember, that it doesn't choose. But when you look at Roy Sullivan's life, not just the strikes, but the frequency, the timing, the locations, you begin to wonder. Not whether he was cursed, not whether he was unlucky, but whether something marked him, chose him. And once it did, it never let go. What began in a fire lookout tower high above the Blue Ridge Mountains became one of the most terrifying, unexplained human experiences on record. And it all started with a job meant to keep watch for danger. He never imagined it would come from the sky itself. Most wilderness assignments demand a tolerance for silence. But there's a difference between silence and stillness. Silence is an absence of sound. Stillness is the absence of life. And sometimes, when the wind sweeps across a fire lookout tower, it carries something with it. Something that sounds almost like speech. The incident began quietly, in the Bitterroot Range of western Montana. The tower was perched at nearly 8,000 feet, surrounded by alpine forest and narrow ridgelines. The nearest ranger station sat over 40 miles away by foot, and the radio connection was often spotty. The lookout assigned that season was a mid-career ranger named Stephen Holt, experienced, level-headed, and well-regarded by his peers. He'd served over a dozen seasons in towers across the Pacific Northwest and had even written procedural material for new recruits. If anyone was built for solitude, it was Holt. But on the fifth night of his rotation, just as the sun dropped behind the distant peaks and the long stretch of dusk set in, he began to hear something. At first, it came as a trick of the breeze, brief flutters of noise too vague to understand, almost like distant music or leaves brushing one another just outside the windows. But it wasn't the wind itself that bothered him. It was the rhythm, the cadence. There were breaks in the noise, pauses, inflections. It began to sound like sentences, like speech. He chalked it up to the environment. High elevation wind currents can echo strangely against rock faces. But by the third night, the sound had grown clearer, not louder, just more structured. It wasn't a conversation, exactly. It was more like fragments, phrases. He couldn't make out the words, but he could feel them. Like they were meant for him, even if he didn't yet understand what they said. That was when he retrieved his recorder. Rangers were issued basic audio devices to log unusual animal sounds, wind pressure readings, or field notes. Holt placed the device on the window ledge nearest the source of the noise, an eastern-facing pane that looked out across a saddle valley. He let it run for several hours, then listened back just before dawn. What he heard on the tape was not what he'd heard with his ears. Instead of whispers, there were sudden bursts of static, short, violent crackles that overloaded the speaker. But beneath them, something else, hidden in the low frequencies, a pattern, a pulse, and then, as if rising from beneath layers of soil, something that did resemble speech, but not in any known language. It was sharp, rhythmic, filled with repetition, like a chant, like someone practicing syllables that weren't meant to be spoken aloud. He sent the audio to the regional office, asking if atmospheric interference could cause such distortion. They never responded. Over the following week, the whispers returned nightly, always between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., always during the lightest wind. And it wasn't just sound. Holt reported a growing sense of presence, that the air inside the tower would shift during these hours, pressure dropping suddenly, as if something had entered. He described a faint warmth on the back of his neck, the sensation of standing too close to a heat source, even though the stove was unlit. And then, a change. The phrases became more familiar. They began to mimic his own voice. At first, just his name, drawn out, distorted. Then full sentences. Words he'd spoken days earlier. Things he'd said aloud only once, and only in solitude. They were repeated back to him, fragment by fragment, like something was listening, collecting, and then rehearsing. He unplugged the recorder, shut the windows, tried to ignore it. But the sound never seemed to come from outside anymore. It was now inside the tower, inside the walls, inside the air. After the 9th night, he abandoned the tower, left without clearance, hiked down on foot in the middle of the night, and arrived at the ranger station with bloodshot eyes and a week's worth of recordings. He would not return. Forest Service officials classified the event as audio-induced stress stemming from high-altitude isolation. That was the official explanation, but the tapes he handed over were never publicly released. Unofficially, the story spread. Other lookouts began to admit, quietly, off record, that they too had heard strange sounds in the wind. One ranger, stationed hundreds of miles to the south, claimed the whispers began after he spoke to Holt on a shared radio channel. He believed whatever it was. It could travel, not across land, but through speech, through repetition, through sound. Acoustic specialists have since speculated that Holt may have been exposed to infrasound, low-frequency noise that's imperceptible to the human ear but capable of inducing unease, anxiety, even hallucinations. Generated naturally by wind passing through narrow canyons or pressure systems shifting over ridgelines, infrasound has been documented to produce effects that mimic paranoia. But here's the problem with that theory. Infrasound is invisible. It's subtle. It's not recordable. And Holt's tapes weren't empty. They were full of voices. When audio experts ran spectral analysis on what little data had leaked from the case, they found odd spikes, frequencies not normally present in natural environments. One section of the waveform resembled a human heartbeat, Another matched the cadence of Morse code, but didn't translate to anything known. There's one final detail. Holt kept a logbook during his stay at the tower, required procedure. Most of it was mundane: weather, wildlife, occasional notes on air traffic. But on the last page, scrawled in large, hurried letters, were 6 words. It doesn't need to speak clearly. Then, below that, a second line, added in shakier handwriting. It only needs you to listen. The tower was eventually taken down. Officially, it was due to structural instability. But ask the rangers who served in that region, and they'll give you a different answer. They'll tell you that sometimes the wind isn't just wind. Sometimes it's something else. And once you've heard it, once you've really heard it, you carry a piece of it with you forever. Every year, thousands of hikers set out into the backcountry of North America, some in search of solitude, others adventure, and a few for reasons even they can't fully explain. Most return, changed only by weather and time, but some don't come back at all. And in the dense stretches of wilderness where help is days away and signals fade into static, the line between an accident and something else becomes harder to define. This is the story of one of them. It was late August in the Okanogan-Wenatchee National Forest of Washington State. The weather was temperate, skies clear, fire danger low. A solo hiker named Daniel Wynn, age 34, left the trailhead near Hidden Lake with plans to complete a 3-day loop along an infrequently traveled ridge route. Daniel was experienced. He'd completed multiple solo hikes, kept detailed itineraries, and checked in with park authorities before departure. His destination was a decommissioned fire lookout known locally as Gray Cap Tower, a narrow, creaking structure perched high above the tree line. It hadn't been staffed in over a decade, but still stood intact, used occasionally as a rest shelter by long haulers. He never returned. 3 days passed, then 5. Search and rescue were deployed. Helicopters scanned the ridgelines. Dogs combed the switchbacks. His vehicle remained undisturbed at the trailhead. No signs of injury, no blood, no distress flares. Just absence. What they did find was his backpack. It was located nearly a mile off trail at the base of a sheer slope. Tucked beneath a ledge, it showed no signs of struggle or animal interference. Inside were food rations, a working flashlight, half a liter of water, and his journal. And it's here, in the pages of that notebook, that Daniel's story begins to break away from anything normal. The early entries were standard. Day 1. Weather reports, terrain notes, meal logs. Day 2, mild elevation sickness, cold night, sighting of a mountain goat near dusk. But starting on day 3, the tone shifted. Can't shake the feeling I'm not alone. Something about the quiet here feels wrong. Too quiet, no birds this morning. Then, the next page. Saw someone on the ridge across from the tower. Black coat, just standing there. Thought maybe another hiker, but they didn't wave. Just turned and walked back into the trees. That entry was underlined 3 times. Later that night. Heard footsteps around the tower last night. Slow, deliberate. Circled the base twice. Tried shining my light, but saw nothing. Still, I know I heard them. The final legible entry was short, just 6 words, scrawled unevenly across a half-torn page. It's waiting outside. Won't let me leave. And then, nothing. The handwriting changed after that. Illegible markings, slashes of ink across pages, circles drawn over and over again until they tore through the paper. As if he had tried and failed to articulate something that didn't translate. The investigation into Daniel's disappearance yielded no definitive answers. Officials speculated that he may have suffered a psychological break, brought on by altitude, dehydration, or solitude, that he wandered off trail and succumbed to the elements. But there were problems with that theory. For one, his supplies were mostly untouched. His water purification tablets were unused, and there were signs he had made camp at the tower, slept, at least once, on the narrow cot, still bolted to the floor. So, if he was in distress, why stay put for so long? Second, the footprint evidence around the tower was confusing. There were prints, Daniel's boots clearly identifiable. But there were others as well, larger, wider gait, barefoot, tracks that circled the tower multiple times and then vanished mid-stride on a patch of stone where no prints should have ended. The official search lasted 11 days. After that, the case was closed as a probable fall or animal encounter, though no remains were found. Grey Cap Tower was boarded up the following season, but locals, those who knew the land well, told a different story. They spoke of an old legend, one passed down by early logging camps and native oral tradition alike, a presence they referred to only as the Mirror Walker, a watcher that mimicked movements, voices, even expressions, seen at times in the reflection of lake water or frost-covered windows, never fully, just a glimpse, just enough to make you question whether you were seeing yourself or something wearing you. There are other sightings, too, scattered across the years. Trail reports of hikers who claimed to see people where no people should be, motionless figures on distant slopes, always alone, always watching. One described it as being stared at from behind glass you couldn't break. Acoustic anomalies were also common near the tower. Rangers posted at a newer site roughly 12 miles south reported hearing soft knocking sounds at night, always in sets of 3, coming from the trees uphill in terrain too steep for human passage. Skeptics argue that wildlife, especially cougars or bears, could be responsible for such reports. That fear and isolation breed stories. But then, there's the matter of the second backpack. 8 years later, during a fire mitigation project in the same region, a crew clearing brush near Grey Cap's Ridge came across a second pack. Older, frayed by time. Inside, a torn sleeping bag, a rusted camping stove, and a field journal. The name on the inside cover had faded, but one phrase was still legible. I saw myself watching from the tree line. No missing person matched the description of the gear. Whether it was a copycat event, a coincidence, or something else entirely, is unknown. What is known is this. Grey Cap Tower remains one of the few places in the Cascade backcountry with multiple reports of disappearances, all solo hikers, all leaving behind journals, and none with conclusive causes of death or loss. Perhaps it's just the land, the isolation, the silence that eats away at you when you've been alone too long. Or perhaps there's something out there that waits, watches, learns, and when the time is right, steps forward wearing a face that looks almost like yours, but not quite, just different enough to notice when it's already too late. Light is supposed to guide us. It cuts through fog. It signals danger or safety. A flare, a headlamp, a lantern, each with meaning, each with purpose. But what happens when the light you see wasn't sent by anyone? When it appears in a place where there should be no one at all? When it blinks like a message, and no one ever claims to have sent it? This chapter begins in northern Idaho, near the Selkirk Mountains. The elevation here is sharp, the valleys deep and dense. During fire season, the landscape becomes a labyrinth of ridgelines and treetops, too thick for trucks, too remote for anything but air support and isolated fire lookouts. In 1997, a veteran lookout named Jessamine Rourke was stationed on a peak known as Thompson Watch. The tower had a wide visual field, nearly 270 degrees, and had seen little in the way of structural updates since it was built in the 1930s. It was stable, weatherproof, and completely analog. No cell coverage, no generators, just maps, a wind gauge, a two-way radio, and a long pair of binoculars. Her assignment was standard: 21 days, solo, watching for lightning strikes and smoke plumes. The days were long, quiet, uneventful, until night 8. Shortly after 2 a.m., she noticed a flicker of white light just above the tree line on the far side of the eastern valley. At first, she assumed it was a distant hiker, but it didn't move like a headlamp. It didn't sway or bounce. It blinked, rhythmically. She waited, counted the intervals. 3 long flashes, 2 short, then silence. Then it repeated. She grabbed her logbook, started jotting down the sequence. The pattern came again: 3 long, 2 short, 1 long. That's when it hit her. It resembled Morse code. She didn't know Morse offhand, so she transcribed the sequence and marked the exact time: 2:13 a.m. The next night, it returned. Same valley, same pattern, same duration. She radioed the nearest ranger station to ask if anyone had been dispatched to the East Ridge. Negative. The area was marked as inactive. No teams, no hikers, no aircraft, no structure at that elevation. Jessamine decided to signal back. Using a mirror during daylight and a flashlight at night, she sent a reply from the tower deck. The same sequence: 3 long, 2 short, 1 long. She repeated it twice, then waited. Nothing. The light didn't return that night, nor the next. Then, 5 days later, it came back, closer this time, higher up the ridge and brighter, almost level with the tower. This time, the flashes were longer, more complex. She tried to document the sequence, but it moved too quickly. Staccato bursts, with odd pauses. Then suddenly, silence again. She contacted Park Communications. They reviewed local airspace logs. No choppers, no aircraft, no flare reports, no meteor activity. The area, officially, was dark. That's when she started hearing the stories. Another lookout, posted nearly 120 miles south, had seen something similar 2 seasons prior, a blinking light across a canyon where no trails existed. The patterns didn't match Morse precisely, but they weren't random either. He described it as a deliberate language of pauses. And then there was an older case, 1954. A tower known as Gable Point, long since dismantled, had logged reports of a ghost beacon, a light seen over 7 consecutive nights in early August. The lookout at the time, Harold Morris, wrote, "Flashing light at 0200 hours again. Seems to be calling to me. But every time I try to respond, it stops, like it knows I'm watching." His final entry before rotation ended with an unsettling note. "Last night, I didn't see the light. I saw someone holding it." There was never any follow-up. So what were these signals? Some suggested electrical interference, auroras, distant lightning flashes, atmospheric reflection. But those phenomena don't form consistent sequences, and they don't appear in the same location night after night. Others considered residual energy, a phenomenon where traumatic or highly emotional events become embedded in the environment. Like a loop, a memory burned into the land itself, replaying for reasons no one understands. These theories are often dismissed by mainstream science. But in isolated towers with nothing but time and horizon, they tend to gain traction. Still, others proposed something more disturbing, that these lights are calls, not echoes, and they're waiting for someone to answer correctly. The final development came during Jessamine's last week at Thompson Watch. She was sitting by the window around 3 a.m., drinking from a tin mug, listening to the wind shift through the stovepipe when the light returned. But this time, it didn't blink. It just held steady. One long, unwavering glow for over 3 minutes. Then, it disappeared instantly. The following morning, she hiked down into the valley against protocol, determined to find the origin point. GPS placed her nearly in line with the prior sightings. She searched for signs of foot traffic, boot prints, debris, broken branches, but the area was undisturbed, except for a set of scorch marks on a flat stone near a dead tree. The stone was discolored, fused in places, like it had been struck by something hot. Her compass wouldn't work in a 10-foot radius around it. The needle spun slowly, never settled. She reported the finding. A team came up 2 days later. By then, the marks were gone. The stone no longer scorched. Her photos had overexposed white patches where the scorch had been. Even the tree bark, which she swore was peeled from heat, had somehow grown back intact. Jessamine didn't return the next season. In her final report, she wrote, "If you see a light in the valley, don't answer, don't even look too long. It's not trying to reach you, it's trying to read you." Since then, at least 4 other lookouts in the Pacific Northwest have quietly reported similar events. Coded lights, stationary flashes, the sense that someone or something is signaling from the tree line and waiting to be understood. But to this day, no source has been found. No tower, no person, no camp, just a blink, a pulse, a question sent out into the dark. From somewhere we don't yet understand, and maybe never will. There is a particular stillness that comes in the early hours of a mountaintop watch. Not peace, not quiet, something else. A stillness that almost seems to wait for you to notice it. The absence of wind, the flat silence between cicada calls, the creaking of wooden beams that should not creak unless someone or something has shifted weight nearby. This is what Glenn Hodges began to notice during his 3rd rotation at Copper Ridge Lookout, a lonely outpost deep within Colorado's San Juan wilderness. It was mid-July of 2004, during a dry lightning season that had lit dozens of minor spot fires across the range. Glenn had volunteered for double duty, a full 42-day stretch, because he said the solitude helped him think. But the solitude didn't stay quiet. At first, it was simple things. His field notebook left closed on the desk would be open the next morning. His lantern, stored beneath the cot, found sitting on the window ledge. A pocket knife, always placed at the same corner of the kitchen shelf, once discovered outside on the steps, blade extended. At first, Glenn assumed it was absent-mindedness. Long hours, poor sleep, routines gone stale. He told himself the mind plays tricks, especially when there's no voice to speak to, no movement beyond the horizon. But the events became more specific, more deliberate. It was during his 15th night when he woke to the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the planks just outside the cabin. Not animals, not raccoons or birds. These were heavy, slow, 2-legged, measured. He rose from the cot, flashlight in hand, and stepped to the door. No one. He circled the structure. No signs of wildlife, no tracks in the dirt. The steps had ceased the moment he stood. That night, he sat up with his camera, watched the perimeter until dawn. Nothing. The following morning, the pantry door, which he kept latched by habit, was wide open. A single tin of beans sat on the floor, undented but dusty, as though it had been moved, not dropped. He checked his logbook. Every page from the last 5 days had been torn out. Not missing, just ripped neatly down the spine and folded into a stack beneath the cot mattress. His handwriting still legible, but the ink was smudged and in places wet, though there'd been no rain. He began documenting everything, taking photographs, time-stamped, keeping dual logs, one written, one audio. In his voice recorder from July 19th, you can hear the edge creeping in. It's getting harder to keep straight what I moved and what's being moved. I took a picture of the lamp. I'm going to check if it shifts again. I swear the shadows aren't falling the same way twice. The pictures tell a story all their own. In one, the mirror near the bunk reflects what appears to be a second figure. Too tall, indistinct, like someone standing behind Glenn as he takes the photo. He insists he was alone. The image was scanned later by a park official. Metadata confirmed no editing. But perhaps the most disturbing entry came on July 23rd at 2:44 a.m., recorded during a windless night. I didn't sleep. Something was in the cabin with me. I didn't hear it enter. I didn't see it. But I could feel the pressure change. Like the air got thicker. My ears popped. My nose bled. When I turned on the light, the lamp bulb shattered. Just shattered. I'm done pretending it's the wind. The cabin had no broken windows, no sign of entry. But in the morning, he found a trail of damp prints across the floor, barefoot, human in shape, but elongated, as if stretched. The prints vanished halfway to the front door. He radioed the ranger station. When the emergency response team reached him 14 hours later, they found him sitting outside on a lawn chair, wrapped in a thermal blanket, unresponsive. He hadn't left the cabin. He hadn't eaten. He just sat, facing the trees. Inside, they found the camera, its lens cracked, the logbooks shredded, and one final photograph. The image was out of focus, as if taken during motion. But in the center, caught in the middle of the frame, was the interior of the cabin, with a shadow on the far wall. The kind of shadow cast when someone stands between a light and the wall behind them. But the flashlight, they noted, was lying on the floor, pointing away from that wall. There was no physical way for that shadow to exist. So what was it? Skeptics will say this was sleep deprivation, a case study in psychological breakdown. 42 days alone can stretch the boundaries of what a person believes is real. The human brain, under enough pressure, can fill the silence with monsters. But others, some of them former lookouts, have begun to whisper about Copper Ridge. How it was built over a burial site long abandoned. How rangers have quietly rerouted assignments away from that peak. And how even now, the motion sensor cameras installed for fire surveillance sometimes trigger in the middle of the night, only to capture nothing but an empty room and the faintest distortion, in the shape of a man who isn't there. Whatever presence haunted Glenn Hodges left no physical fingerprint, no name, no voice, just an unshakable truth carved into his eyes as they found him staring at the woods. Something had come into the cabin, and it had no need to open a door. They say that when you've worked long enough among the ridgelines, you begin to see things before they happen. Smoke before fire, flickers of motion before wind stirs the branches, and sometimes flame before there's anything to burn. In the late summer of 1986, 3 separate fire lookouts stationed across the Bitterroot Range in western Montana filed nearly identical reports, submitted within hours of each other. Each of them saw what they described as sustained flame. Not smoke, not sunlight glinting off the hills. Flame, orange, flickering, moving with the rhythm of fire, but in places with no record of lightning strikes, no evidence of campgrounds, no trace of fuel. What they saw wasn't on the map. What they saw was gone by the time anyone could reach it. Jim Talmadge, a lookout with nearly 20 years' experience, was stationed on Bear Jaw Peak. On the night of August 12th, just past midnight, He spotted what he initially thought was a spot fire flaring up 5 ridgelines west. Standard procedure. He logged it, marked the coordinates, radioed dispatch. Then he waited for the smoke, but no smoke rose. He checked again. Still flame. Still dancing in the same narrow clearing. Except the trees weren't burning. They weren't even swaying. The fire gave no sound, no crackle, and after roughly 4 minutes, it vanished. No smoke, no cinders, no glow, nothing. It blinked out, as if it had never been there at all. When a helicopter team was sent the next morning, they found no signs of scorched earth, no ash, no heat signatures. The area was undisturbed, pristine. Jim later admitted to a colleague off the record that he hadn't been alone in the tower when he saw the fire. He said someone else was there, not physically, not in the flesh, but as the flames shimmered, he said he felt it. A presence. The air in the cabin changed temperature. A pressure built behind his eyes, like a slow pulse. He swore he heard whispering beneath the hum of the radio, a sound that didn't come from the equipment, but around it, just below the range of human speech. He'd seen fires before. Hundreds, but never one that refused to burn. It wasn't the first time either. Centuries before the Bitterroot Towers were built, the Salish and Kootenai peoples spoke of the fire that walks the highlands, a wandering light that flickers without heat, seen only by those who linger too long in the mountains alone. They called it Tueunum Ulutma, the flame that watches. According to oral tradition, the fire appears not to warm, but to warn. It comes before loss, before illness, before disappearance. To witness it, they said, was to be marked. Another lookout, Sandra Greaves, recounted a similar vision in 1997 while stationed on Mount Gilbraith. The first night of her rotation, she watched what she thought was a campfire just below the north slope. She scanned with binoculars, no campers, no movement, but the flame held. She watched for nearly an hour. She reported it, logged it. But just before dawn, when she returned to observe again, there was no fire. And now, in its place, a perfectly circular patch of soil, darker than the rest. She hiked to it herself. The ground was cool. There were no embers, no burn marks on the trees. But in the center of that blackened ring, she found something she couldn't explain. A set of bird bones, bleached white, perfectly arranged, set in a spiral. And beneath them, a stone the size of her fist, scorched entirely black and warm to the touch, though the ground around it was cold. Sandra left the tower 3 weeks early. She never returned to lookout duty again. Skeptics have pointed toward natural gas emissions, methane leaking from underground pockets, igniting briefly under specific pressure changes, a phenomenon known as spontaneous vent fires. Others cite Fata Morgana mirages, optical illusions caused by layers of hot and cold air bending distant light sources into distorted images. In the right conditions, headlights from a car miles away could be warped into what looks like flame. But that doesn't explain the sounds, the low humming, the pressure, the feeling of being watched, the aftermath of deadened silence that followed these sightings, and above all, the consistency of what the lookouts described. It didn't burn like fire. It moved like it remembered fire, as if it was mimicking flame, but not consuming anything, just showing itself. If it were only 1 or 2 accounts, we might shrug it off. But the logbooks say otherwise. Dozens of reports spanning generations, most dismissed, misfiled, or buried under smoke priority calls. All of them describing the same thing: flames that linger without heat, that vanish without a trace, and are seen only by those who are truly alone. Some say it's residual energy, a kind of geological haunting. Others whisper of time slips, moments where the land remembers what once burned there and plays it back for those tuned to the right frequency of isolation. But if the old stories hold any truth, then the flame doesn't come to show you the past, it comes to warn you of the future, and many of those who saw it didn't live long enough to understand what it meant. Fire lookouts are trained to track the passage of time, hour by hour, minute by minute, scanning ridgelines, recording coordinates, logging temperatures, wind direction, humidity. They are observers of movement, of change, and of time itself. But what happens when time disappears? In the fall of 2004, a seasoned lookout named Derek Miles, stationed at Slate Ridge Tower in the Cascades, began his evening check-in just before 6 p.m. He climbed the iron steps with his usual thermos, his clipboard under one arm. The weather was dry. The sun dipped low behind the tree line. Radio conditions were stable. All routine. He reached the top, stepped into the cabin, and set his things down. The next thing he remembers is waking up on the floor. The sun was gone. His thermos lay open on the far side of the cabin. The radio, dead. The clipboard, missing. His watch read 11:42 p.m. He had no memory of what happened between 6 p.m. and midnight. 6 hours. Gone. He hadn't fallen asleep. That's what he insisted. He never napped during watch. He had no history of sleepwalking, no medication, no alcohol. He hadn't been sick. He wasn't tired. He just lost time. In his personal log, found later in a drawer beneath the cot, he had written only one thing after the incident. There's something wrong with the clocks, but it's not the clocks. Derek descended from the tower before dawn the next morning and drove himself 80 miles to the ranger station without filing a report. He was said to be pale, cold to the touch. One ranger described him as numb in the eyes. He was given leave for what was assumed to be fatigue. But over the following weeks, Derek began to notice changes, not in his memory, though the lost hours never returned, but in his body. 2 deep bruises appeared on his upper back, just below the shoulder blades. Each one shaped like a crescent, symmetrical, as if pressed into his skin from 2 sides. He also reported random nosebleeds, insomnia, a persistent buzzing in his ears. Medical scans showed no trauma, no neurological events. But Derek became convinced something had happened in those hours, something he wasn't supposed to remember, and he wasn't the only one. A pattern began to emerge, hidden in scattered reports over the decades. A lookout in the San Juan Mountains, 1982, who missed an entire evening's radio call-in and swore he had only blinked. Another in Idaho, 1991, who wrote in her journal, "Woke up standing." Every clock says something different, and perhaps most unsettling, an anonymous field note dated July 1975, unsigned, found in a remote supply cache. They took the time, but left the marks. Some researchers point to microsleep episodes, brief, uncontrollable lapses in consciousness, sometimes lasting only seconds, but in rare cases longer, a natural result of prolonged isolation, fatigue, or neurological stress. Others suggest transient global amnesia, a rare condition that erases recent memories without warning. But none of those explain the bruising, none explain the buzzing, and none explain why so many of these lookouts, across regions and decades, describe the same sensations. A pressure in the skull, static behind the eyes, a low-frequency hum just beneath hearing. And more chilling still, they all describe the same phenomenon. When they came back, everything in the cabin had moved. Inches off, slightly rotated, a coffee mug facing the wrong way, a chair turned just enough, a field map hanging upside down, as if someone or something had studied the space, then tried to put it back. Imperfectly. Derek Miles never returned to the lookout. He moved to Arizona, stopped responding to ranger communications, and eventually vanished from contact. But in 2013, nearly a decade later, a camper hiking the old logging trails near Slate Ridge found a weathered clipboard buried beneath a cairn of rocks. The page was stained and half torn, but one sentence remained legible. Whatever comes in that hour doesn't come from outside. Skeptics write it off. A fugue state. A psychological break. But ask anyone who's spent a season alone in those towers, and they'll tell you, time doesn't always move the way it should. Sometimes it skips, it folds, it hides. And sometimes, when you look away for just a second, when you blink, time looks back, and it takes something with it. She watched the forests longer than anyone else, longer than most of us have been alive, through thunder, through drought, through seasons that blurred together in heat and haze. Kathy Shupman stood her post, high above the tree line, watching, waiting, protecting. She wasn't a myth. She wasn't part of the strange and unexplainable like the others we've explored tonight. But her story, her final watch, belongs here just the same. Because it reminds us that fire lookouts don't just face what's unseen. They face what's all too real. Kathy served nearly 5 decades as a lookout for the U.S. Forest Service in Northern California. She was posted at the Buckhorn Lookout in the Klamath National Forest, a station more remote than most, perched between ridges where the air crackles with dry tension and summer skies turn copper with smoke. She wasn't there for glory. She was there for the work, for the mountain, for the trees. Her colleagues described her as quiet but precise. She recorded every spark, every wind shift, every heat lightning flicker that danced across the horizon. She could identify a column of smoke miles away and know whether it was drifting from a campfire or the start of something worse. She spent more nights alone in the watchtower than most people spend in their own homes, and she did it with grace, with care, with a devotion that's vanishing from the world. On July 29th, 2022, the McKinney fire ignited near the Klamath River. Fueled by drought, wind, and extreme heat, it exploded in size overnight. The mountains lit up like matchsticks. Communication towers went down. Evacuation orders were issued for entire swaths of the forest. And in the middle of it all, still reporting, still watching, was Kathy Shupman. That night, Kathy made her final report. Short, clear, professional. Just like every other night. She signed off. They never heard from her again. The fire reached her cabin before dawn. When the teams arrived, they found the watchtower burned to its frame. The surrounding forest had become ash. And Kathy, along with 3 other community members, was gone. She had stayed as long as she could. She had done her duty. They called it tragic. They called it an accident. But those who knew her, they called it a sacrifice. Because lookouts like Kathy aren't just surveyors of smoke and flame. They are the last eyes in places we've forgotten. They carry knowledge passed down from generations of solitude. They know what it means to hold still when the world wants to run. And sometimes, that stillness costs everything. One of her fellow lookouts, who trained with Kathy in the early 2000s, left a note pinned to a scorched pine just beyond the ruins of her post. It read, "You watch the world for us. Now, we'll carry the watch for you." The Forest Service retired her call sign. They held a private gathering on a ridge where she once spotted her first blaze. And for just a moment, all radios in the region went silent. A full minute of silence. A stillness not often felt in fire season, a moment of respect for the woman who stayed when no one else could. Kathy's story doesn't end with whispers in the trees. It doesn't end with lights in the sky or missing time. It ends with a truth more powerful than any haunting, that the forest demands everything, and those who love it enough will give everything in return. So tonight, as we close this watch, remember her, not as a victim, but as a guardian, a quiet sentinel of the peaks, a final light in the tower, and a reminder that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just listens, and waits, and holds the line until it no longer can. There's something about the high places, where the air thins, where voices don't echo but vanish, where the roads end and silence begins. The fire lookouts of North America have seen more than smoke on the horizon. They've stood watch not just over trees, but over time itself, over generations, over lives come and gone, over things that were never meant to be seen, yet were. You've heard their stories tonight. The man struck from the heavens again and again, as if chosen by forces no storm could explain. The whispers in the wind that had no mouth, no meaning, just motion. The hiker who vanished without a trace, leaving behind a journal full of fear and unseen eyes. The phantom lights that blinked in code across vast distances, with no sender. The invisible guest in the cabin who never knocked, yet moved through the room like memory in motion. The fires that burned with no fuel, leaving behind no heat, no ash, only questions. The hours that slipped away like fog, leaving bruises, buzzing, and a hole where time used to be. And Kathy Shupman, whose final watch was not a myth or mystery, but a sacrifice as real and raw as the earth she stood to protect. These towers, these lonely outposts in the clouds, they aren't just relics of another age. They are mirrors, reflections of who we become when no one else is around to witness us. They expose what hides in the quiet, and sometimes, what doesn't want to be found. Isolation doesn't just test the body, it bends the mind. It opens the door to things we pretend not to believe in, until we hear them, just outside the window, until we see them between the trees, until we feel them breathing beside us when we're supposed to be alone. These are more than stories. They are warnings. They are memorials. They are truths hidden in the high places. So, if you ever find yourself at the base of one of these towers, and you look up and see a figure in the window, or a flash in the distance, or hear something carried on the wind that doesn't quite belong to the storm, listen closely, because the forest remembers, and some watches never end. If these accounts stirred something in you, some distant memory, some lingering question, then you've already taken the first step. There are more stories like these, dozens, hundreds, buried in ranger logs, whispered across trails, and etched into the margins of time. And here at MindFuel, we'll bring them to light. So if you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed, because the wilderness is vast, the shadows are long, and the unknown is just getting started. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon and your mind open to the unexplained. This has been MindFuel,